My name is Sophia, and this is a tale that nearly shattered my existence. It's curious how life can spiral into chaos when you least anticipate it, and how a person you once held dear can transform into a complete stranger. It all began so innocently, truly. My husband, James, and I had shared 8 years of marriage, a lovely home, fulfilling careers, and our beloved golden retriever Buddy, who was like our child. Yet, like many relationships, ours encountered a tumultuous phase. Though we remained together, emotionally we had begun to drift apart. James's late hours left me feeling neglected, as if I were fading away in my own home. I was blissfully unaware of my vulnerability until Jan entered the scene. Ryan was my husband's best friend and a frequent guest at our house. He had been part of our lives for years. He and James played basketball together, and the three of us would often share dinners talking about everything from life to sports to work. But as time went on, Ryan and I started to connect in a way that felt different. It wasn't intentional, at least not at first. We joke around, laugh a little too hard at each other's jokes, and slowly I began to look forward to the moments when John would come over. Those innocent conversations between us started to become more personal. We'd talk about our frustrations in life, and before I knew it, I found myself sharing things with Jan that I hadn't even told James. I'll admit I was flattered by the attention Ryan noticed, the little things, my new hairstyle, the way I styled my clothes, things that James had stopped noticing long ago. It felt nice to be seen again, to feel important, but I never thought it would go beyond that. At least that's what I told myself. Then one evening things took a turn. It was a typical Friday night. James had to stay late at work again, and Jan came over to help me with some repairs around the house. Buddy was excited as always, jumping around, wagging his tail, and barking happily at John's arrival. Everything seemed normal, but there was a different energy between John and me that night. It was in the way he smiled, the way his hand brushed against mine when he handed me a tool. We laughed as we fixed a broken cabinet in the kitchen, but there was a tension growing between us. It was subtle at first, but it was there. After the repairs were done, we sat on the couch with Buddy between us, watching some random show on TV. The air felt thick, like something was bound to happen, but neither of us was willing to make the first move. And then it happened. I don't even know how to explain it. One moment we were sitting there, and the next, Jan reached over and placed his hand on mine. It wasn't aggressive, but it wasn't friendly either. It was something else, something more. I should have pulled away. I should have gotten up and told him to leave, but I didn't. Instead, I let it happen. The feeling of his touch sent a shiver down my spine, and for a split second I didn't care about the consequences. It was as if my mind shut down, and all I could feel was the warmth of his hand on mine. Buddy, sprawled at our feet, stirred just a bit, yet remained motionless, as if he could feel that something was amiss. But then reality came crashing down. I heard the front door unlock, and my heart skipped a beat as James walked in, completely unaware of what he had just interrupted. Ryan quickly pulled his hand away, and I jumped up from the couch, my face flushed with guilt. It all happened so fast, yet the tension was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Hey, I'm home," James said casually, setting his keys on the table. "What's happening?" "Nothing at all," I blurted out, my voice rising a pitch too high. "We were simply watching TV when John stood up," his discomfort mirroring my own. "Yeah, I was just about to head out," he said, deliberately avoiding James's gaze. James didn't seem to notice the awkwardness between us, or maybe he was just too tired to care. He walked over to Buddy and started petting him, and for a moment I thought we were in the clear. Maybe James hadn't noticed anything, maybe this could all just blow over, and we'd never have to speak of it again. But deep down I knew that wasn't the case. Something had shifted between John and me, something that couldn't be undone. We hadn't crossed the line physically, but emotionally we were already standing on the edge, and I was terrified of what would happen next. As Ryan left that night, he gave me a look that told me he was feeling the same way I was. This wasn't over, not by a long shot, and that was the moment I realized I was in too deep. The days following that night were a blur of confusion and guilt. I couldn't stop thinking about John, his touch, his presence, the way he made me feel noticed, but every time I thought of him I was immediately hit with a wave of guilt. James hadn't done anything wrong. He was a good husband, distracted and tired, yes, but he didn't deserve what was happening behind his back. I tried to shake it off, convincing myself that it was just a moment of weakness, nothing more. But as much as I wanted to bury it, John was always there. He would text me random things like asking how I was doing or if Buddy had been behaving. It wasn't overly flirtatious, but the subtext was clear. He hadn't forgotten that night either. I knew I should have ignored him, but I didn't. The truth is, I enjoyed the attention, and that realization made me hate myself even more. Every time I replied, I felt like I was playing with fire, but I couldn't stop. Things came to a head one evening when James decided to invite John over for dinner. He said it had been a while since the three of us had spent time together, and I couldn't exactly argue without raising suspicion, so I put on a smile and pretended like everything was normal, but inside I was a wreck. The dinner was awkward, at least for me. James and Ryan were their typical selves, laughing and chatting about sports, exchanging tales from work. Yet I found it hard to concentrate. Each time Ryan glanced my way, it felt as if he could peer into my very soul. And with every smile from James, a wave of guilt washed over me, making me feel like the worst person alive. After dinner, we migrated to the living room. Buddy trailed behind us, as he always did. Ryan settled onto the couch, and I paused for a heartbeat, contemplating the space between us before finally taking a seat beside him, mindful to maintain a deliberate distance. James was in the kitchen, tidying up, completely unaware of the tension simmering between John and me. Then, in a moment etched in my memory, Buddy leaped onto the couch, positioning himself right between us, just as he had the night before. His tail wagged, blissfully ignorant of the emotional tempest brewing in the room. John chuckled and reached out to pet him, and for a fleeting instant, his hand brushed against mine. It felt like déjà vu, but this time I recoiled, my heart racing in my chest. I couldn't endure this any longer. I stood up abruptly, startling both John and Buddy. "I'm going to help James in the kitchen," I said, my voice trembling. I needed to escape. The walls felt like they were closing in, suffocating me under the weight of my own guilt. John remained silent, merely nodding, his expression inscrutable. In the kitchen, I found James drying dishes, humming softly to himself, blissfully unaware of the emotional catastrophe unfolding just out of sight. I observed him for a fleeting moment, and a wave of guilt crashed over me like a freight train. This was all wrong. Everything about this was fundamentally flawed. "Hey, can I talk to you?" I inquired, my voice barely rising above a whisper. James turned to me, his smile fading as he caught sight of my expression. "What's wrong?" he asked. I hesitated, my mind racing. Should I reveal the truth? Should I lay bare everything and risk losing him forever? Yet, as I stood there gazing into his worried eyes, I understood that I couldn't. Not like this. The truth would shatter him, and I wasn't prepared for that. I wasn't ready to unravel our lives. Nothing, I deceived while mustering a smile. "I've been feeling somewhat out of sorts lately. The pressures of work have been quite overwhelming." James relaxed, a clear sense of relief washing over him. "You know you can talk to me about anything, right?" he said, pulling me into a hug. "I'm here for you." His embrace felt like a lifeline, drawing me back from the brink. In that moment, I made a decision. I would end whatever was happening with JN. I couldn't continue walking this perilous path, risking everything for something that held no value. But fate had other plans in store. The following day, I reached out to JN, expressing the urgency of our conversation. I felt it was crucial to clarify that this situation had to come to an end. I was unwilling to jeopardize my marriage for a momentary attraction, no matter how intense it seemed. He agreed to meet, but rather than suggesting a public venue, he proposed coming over when James was out. Despite my reservations, I acquiesced. When Ryan arrived, Buddy greeted him with his usual enthusiasm, blissfully unaware of the underlying tension. I guided Ryan into the living room, resolute in my intention to have a serious discussion. I needed to establish boundaries and put an end to this before it escalated, but Ryan had different plans. As soon as we settled into our seats, he leaned in closer than I had anticipated, his gaze firmly fixed on mine. "Sophia, I can't stop thinking about you," he confessed, his voice low and intense. My heart raced, but I shook my head. "Ryan, this is not right. We cannot proceed like this. I have feelings for James. I understand." He reached for my hand again, but I cannot control my emotions. I withdrew my hand and stood up, creating space between us. "This must come to an end. We cannot continue down this path." John rose, frustration evident upon his visage. "Sophia, you sense it as well, I can tell." Before I had the chance to reply, the unmistakable sound of the front door unlocking washed over me, sending a surge of panic coursing through my veins. James arrived home earlier than anticipated. I had not expected him for at least another hour. Ryan stood still, his eyes wide with disbelief. I could hear Buddy barking with enthusiasm from the hallway as James entered. My heart raced in my chest as I grasped the gravity of our situation. There was no way to articulate this without it appearing unfavorable. James stepped into the living room, his face brightening at the sight of me. But that light dimmed the moment he caught sight of Ryan. Confusion and suspicion quickly overtook his features as he shifted his gaze between us, his brow furrowing deeply. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice laced with caution and edged with sharpness. I opened my mouth to respond, but the words eluded me, swallowed by an overwhelming tide of guilt. I understood that there was no way to articulate this without it sounding precisely like what it was: a betrayal. John, sensing the tension, quickly spoke up. "I was just leaving," he said, his voice too casual. "I arrived to see how Buddy was doing." James's eyes narrowed as he glanced between us, clearly unconvinced by the excuse. Why would I need to check on Buddy when Sophia was home? The room fell silent, and in that instant, I understood that no matter how much I wished to, I couldn't reverse what had already begun.